This chat is a free-flowing conversation between you, Max, and Shaka, exercising spiritual curiosity and the Socratic method to explore boundaries, definitions, and differing perspectives. We will dissolve the MF, that is the masculine feminine understanding, and tune you into the healing center of the world, that is Costa Rica. The show starts with a few questions to dive into and really stir you up. It soon takes you into a free flowing conversation, and the last quarter of the show is open to relational or well being dilemma and advice from the show's hosts to you.
Thank you guys for tuning in. Welcome to another episode in this series of the motherfucking quadrant. And here, this is where we are breaking down this masculine and feminine dynamic that enacts within all of us. And today we're going to be talking about the shadow and the light, the dance between the two, and how do they actually dance and how do they actually present themselves. So Shaka is going to introduce a little bit of what we are going to be discussing in these very provocative and what I've found very penetrating questions that really just kind of brought about the sense of me just as a man and really understanding like, wow, I've been dancing this whole time, you know? I feel like it comes a little bit more naturally to women, but in this sense, it was like, wow, like how do I actually approach these things with some of these questions, and what does it really mean to you?
The dance, I think it's just, acknowledging that there's both a light and a shadow inside of ourselves and just understanding how they both interact with each other. I was thinking about like light and shadow being like contrast, depths, like kind of, like casting a shadow or, highlighting something or creating contours or contrast in life. Otherwise, everything's just very one-dimensional. So you kind of need the polar opposites to be dancing with one another in order to know that there is even a polarization in the first place. And then you can kind of swing almost like a pendulum between these two aspects. And then I know we were just talking like before we recorded about any aspect, like even say positive things about ourselves. They like in excess that can become shadow. That can become something that starts to work negatively in your life. And also I think it's important to say that shadow isn't just about negativity or bad things about you. There's like also untapped potentially as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the misconception that we have now, especially in this wellness renaissance, and just coming around like Jungian theories and coming into spirituality. We start to get this sense of what we've been talking about, this masculine, this feminine presence, and how does it present, how do we want to express it, whether we identify with one or the other or both sometimes. It's noticing. I love what you said is that pendulum, because like especially a lot of my writings, I use that as a tool, and it's really for me what became the process. And I think this is like an important way to kind of like cultivate this tool of what helped me to understand this spectrum of the shadow and the light, and not necessarily place a judgment on it and say like, oh well, one's good and one's bad. It was noticing this pendulum. And I was like, okay, if I have all of these traits and I have all of these traits, and these ones created this cause and these ones created this cause, and I know that they were the cause and these are the effects, okay, let me place them there. And then I started noticing like how my emotional body and then also my physical body was doing that, movement. And then I started noticing, okay, well, what is the momentum behind this specific one? When I get placed in a romantic relationship, how do I notice my emotions? And this would be kind of like me stepping into this shadow of a partner that was basically like mirroring me, or maybe they were triggering me so much, or maybe they reminded me of my mom, or maybe they reminded me of my ex, or whatever it was, and it was how was my physical body expressing that to them. But before that, it was the emotional body that was having this
Yeah.
fluctuation. And what I started to notice was like, okay, there is this shadow aspect of the reaction, and then there is this light aspect of the response, and like
Mhm.
which one really gives me time. And
Mhm.
you spoke about this contrast, and for me that gave me a separation to kind of like step back and see them both in this simultaneous contrast, to
Uh-huh.
see, and to kind of see in the whole.
Yeah.
But I think the wholeness kind of comes after. So
Mm.
if you were to say, like, in this dance, I mean, this is kind of like, what we want to bring is like this uncomfortability, like, when you go to the dance floor, it's like a guy coming to grab your hand, or like, you walking up to a girl being like, oh, like, is she gonna accept me, like, to go dance with her? Is she gonna shake that thing on me, it's like, and then she like, not you, not with them pants. And you like, ah, shit, damn, yeah, I'm gonna go this way, I'm gonna go get a drink, but it's like that awkwardness, or like that
Yeah.
feeling of identifying, what that
Yeah.
is. So I think for that first question of that, really, this was like one of the things is like, what is that fear that's present,
Mhm.
um before, I think it was before before the shadow.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you put that so nicely. Like you made it sound like, I mean, dancing with the shadows not like it's not really that nice.
Yeah, it's
Like you made it
weird,
seem
it's
like it's quite
awkward.
fun. It's awkward and it's hard. And it's usually just parts of the self you don't even want to look at. Like it's like I sometimes say it's in the basement. Like it's
Uh-huh.
like somewhere. So like when you talk about the fear, what's the fear around looking at that? Well, I mean it's all the stuff that you've not looked at. So
Hmm.
they're like it might be, yeah, like,
So I think what came up for me, right, and this is where it really came from, because this was
yeah,
my process, because I found the question, and I think this is something we want to really encourage with
yeah,
these questions, is like, spirituality is that, we spoke of this about, questioning, and it's like that's how you figure out the answer. But sometimes we run away from those questions because we are in that shadow. It's like, oh, I don't want to go down into the basement and like look at that,
yeah, absolutely.
but for me, like, this question stirred up that. It was like, um, what was that fear behind it? And it was like, oh, okay, shit, okay. And I started finding myself kind of like out thinking and kind of being in this space that I'm at now. But it was like, okay, at one point you did have this fear,
Mm-hmm.
and at one point you were in your shadow and you really believed that. And I think
Yeah.
that was
Mm.
the portion for me. It was like, I didn't I didn't want to admit that I was in that shadow, because then that's the telling myself, like, oh, you were believing this lie,
Yeah.
you were living this illusion, you were believing this.
Yeah.
So for me, my process was, I come from New York, right? So when I grew up, all we had was like house parties. Like, we would go in there, it'd be pitch black. By the time you left, like, all the walls had like blue marks on like the lower part, because like all the guys' jeans would be like
It's
rubbing on the walls. So for me, that was like a good setting to like visually place myself there and be like, okay, what is that fear of, like, when you were in those house parties,
mm.
like, and it was pitch black, and you knew that girl that you was feeling was like on the other side, and you knew that if you walked over to her, there might be a chance that she might reject you, like, in front of everybody, but really everybody's not looking at you. But that was like the setting for me.
But then you would say then the fear there is the fear you'd say like the fear of rejection.
I Yeah, so when it came down to that, it was like, okay,
And
there
where's
is this rejection in the fear, I mean, in the shadow.
yeah.
So I was like, okay, cool, like, that is what that is. But I used that setting of that dance,
Yes.
because that was really, even placing myself there at, 12, 13, probably 11. I was in some house parties in 11, in all of these different years, and how that shadow evolved and came
Mm.
into existence, from being afraid at first, but then also like growing into this ego thing, like, yo, she gonna come dance with me
Yeah.
anyway. And
Yeah.
there was this almost like confidence behind it.
Overcompensation maybe.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So that rejection kind of turned into like, I'm not quite sure what it turned into later, but it did feel like to me a sense of like, let's say, valor, but like a very empty sense of valor.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, I could go, I can get this girl, or I can get this girl's gonna dance with me because she knows me, she knows how I am. But it was this persona.
Yeah.
And I think it was that, like, stepping into that dance with that confidence, but it was the confidence of wearing that character of the shadow.
I think that's really interesting because like you're talking about kind of like how we start to like become adaptive to these aspects of self. So this is how like trickster, like the shadow is, like, because that's the whole point. It's like these parts of yourself you don't really want to like address and look at because ultimately they come from our wounds or hurt or something like that. And so like, all right, so you've got the rejection itself where you're like, oh, that's really like a really uncomfortable feeling. I don't want to be in that place. I don't want to feel like that. All right, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just like I'm just going to like overstate the case. I'm going to be super confident. And I'm just going to banish that feeling of rejection because it just feels horrible. I don't want to feel like that. And then you just like you say, like that becomes the new state, but it's not necessarily the authentic state because somewhere along the line you've banished this aspect of self and you pretend it doesn't exist in you. And yeah, and I think that's how, and then like you said, like our shadows, like they start to play out unconsciously in our lives. Like we start to see it, like suddenly you start to see things happening and you're like, man, I didn't want that to happen. I was trying to do this and then this is happening. And then like, and then that's when I think like, I sometimes think you've got to have enough shit's got to hit the fan. And then you're like, all right, the way that my life is playing out is not how I want it to play out now. That's kind of what I think pushes most of us to kind of start looking at this stuff and looking at these parts of ourselves that, because you're like, man,
but I still got the dance. So I mean, for me, that's kind of evidence that it works. So that's what
I hear you.
So this is where I'm talking about is like just for men maybe, and this is the question I want to ask you when you come up with your fear, because that's, for me, that kind of compounded the sense of the forcing of the belief that I was this, you know, it was like this creation of it, like you said, and this like compression of the rejection, like, oh no, I can't be rejected, like, you know who I am, I'm that guy, you know. And like you were saying, like with this shadow, like there's this excess. So I think in unraveling that, to kind of preserve the shame and the guilt and all that stuff from being like, oh, you dickhead, look at you, you was like a fucking egotistical, confident, cocky asshole, you know, like, and to save yourself from all of those words, it was like, oh, well, did you really believe that? Like, were you really this? And like kind of coming out of it. And I think this is something we'll tie in later about the sense of forgiveness, but it was that fear that kind of created that shadow aspect, but not necessarily thinking that this place is bad. You know, it was like, oh, this is who I am, without looking at that other side of the pendulum until, you know, I started to grow a little bit older and I started to swing back to that other side. And it was, I think for me, that momentum that pushed me there was that sense of rejection, but the same rejection that was there to slow that momentum down was really acceptance. And it was like accepting this side and being like, oh, that is okay, like to be that confidence and be that side. And also, like, you know, that's a part of myself, no, being in Leo, and that's what I needed to go through, you know, like have all that, you know, shine. And then coming back through that and noticing that rejection was the momentum that pushed it there, and then I can use that acceptance to momentum into that light, you know, and kind of accept both. So what do you feel like was your fear through that experience?
Well, I mean, I definitely say there's definitely fear of rejection, like definitely. I mean, we use that as an example. And it's like really interesting because, like, again, I'm like noticing a real difference, and it might just be our personalities. It might not necessarily mean like, you know, like dynamic, like men and women generally. I think there's something in it that like if I've like got a fear of rejection, like that is what I'll do. I'll just like go, like I'm going back into my shell. I'm taking a step back. I become more aloof. I just become more like, yeah, like I will just withdraw. Like, so that's kind of, but that's also a reaction. So I feel like the fear expressed, or there's the actual fear itself, and then there's the adaptive strategy that we have that then becomes like either hiding it or masking it, or like somehow dealing with it, or not looking at it,
overcompensating
or overcompensate. So this is kind of, there's an adaptive strategy there of just like, how do, like, I've got this really uncomfortable thing that I don't like, it makes me feel so uncomfortable, and you're like, how do I manage that? And I think my adaptive strategy has been like withdraw, or like, like step back.
Yeah, because that sounds like exactly the opposite of what I did.
Yeah, like it's like literally the opposite. Like literally.
I just went full out. Like, So your process was going introverted, and I know that this is also like the dynamic, but I feel like this is why the synergy works so great with us, because your south node is in Aquarius and your north is in Leo. And that's the opposite for me, and it's that same, and it's this, it's showing up again in this, you said adaptive strategy, and I think that's like a beautiful terminology to kind of come around, because we ultimately think sometimes, like, even with fear, that we're dealing with it, but we could just be adapting. So when you went through that strategy, like, what was that experience like?
I mean, what you mean? How did I overcome that, or how did I start to like sort of unpack that?
Well, I guess how did you approach that dance? Like, because you were still adapting, and whether it was kind of like, in my position, I'm like walking up to the girl in the party in the shadow and being like, oh shit, like, she's gonna reject me. It was almost like, if you were that girl in that party, like, if let's set that stage.
Okay.
We in a party, and that is your rejection. Like, nobody's coming to dance with you.
Yeah.
And like, you just go internal.
Yeah.
What was that like in relation for you, and how did that look?
I don't know. Like, I mean, I think it's interesting, this example, because I do think in that example, like, generally as a woman, I don't really need to put myself out there. Like, I'm always gonna have like suitors come and like, try their, you know what I mean?
Excuse me. The luxury of being beautiful.
I mean, like, well, you don't even have to be beautiful, like,
oh, yeah, that's
to be
true.
fair.
That is true.
But yeah, so I think maybe like an opposite, like, I'm trying to think of a time, because there isn't that fear of rejection. That's not high stakes as such, because I do think like men, like, as a pursuit, as in the pursuing energy, definitely there's that, like, there's that.
So maybe something like business related or work related that you had to
I mean, I think you could still say in pursuit, like, if you're in pursuit of something or someone, like, maybe that energy. And there's definitely, like, it's basically when you put yourself on the line. Essentially, you're putting your neck on the line to basically get something that you want. And that's like, and you might get knocked back, you might not get, what you want out of that situation, and you've got to be prepared for that. And I think, like, trying to think, how would I cope with the fear of rejection? It depends, because I think, coming back to, like, I love how you started this conversation, and you're kind of like, you're so like like everything's like kind of outside of yourself. You've got like all of these sections. It's like so clear in front of you, and I love that. Like, as I just feel like that's how your mind, your emotion, that's how you kind of process it and see it. And then I think for me, it's always more intuitive. Like, it's always kind of like, it's always a sense of like, so say if I've got to do something, I've got to put myself out there, I've got to like pursue something, whether that be a personal relationship or a work opportunity, or like, I think there's just this sense where I'm like, I want to, like, this feels awkward, like, it feels uncomfortable, but intuitively I'll know if that's something I need to do. So if it's like, look, you've got to go and, put that application in, and like,
so you've always felt like that?
Yeah, I think so.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, damn, that must be a blessing. So what would that shadow aspect be then for you, when you first started like really realizing that you were in your shadow, to recognize it and then allow it to dance with that light?
So I would say, I mean, maybe I would pick something slightly different, because I feel like I think all of us have got fear of rejection, but I definitely feel like if you're talking about a core wound, I don't know if we're going too deep here, but but like a core wound is like fucking go there, fuck it. But like fear of abandonment, for example. So that's like core wound, right? Then you start to see how it plays out in different situations throughout your life. So again, I think that's where my shadow's shown up most in my life, is in the adaptive strategies around abandonment. Usually in the relational space, I do think that's often where our shadow will show up most, because it's in those interpersonal relationships that are going to activate the deepest part of ourselves, because that's the nature of closeness and connection and vulnerability and relationship. Like, I think if your relationships aren't kind of, you know, showing they're shallow, basically, is what I would say. Like, if you're not kind of seeing things about yourself, or, you know, I'm not saying necessarily being triggered, like trigger, like, I mean, but like generally, if you're not kind of generally being like activated, if stuff's not coming up for you in the relational space, then I suggest that, yeah, you're on a very surface level, because invariably, once you start getting a bit deeper, these are the parts of yourself that are going to get activated. And, you know, thinking about the dance, and we were kind of talking about how like one person's light and shadow like kind of dances with the other person's light and their shadow. And so coming back on myself, like that fear of abandonment, I don't think those core wounds ever go. I don't think they ever disappear. I just think you've just become more aware of your adaptive strategies. I think you become more aware of the environments, places, people that that create more like harm around that wound, and other places that create more healing. And then I think you just act and move accordingly, you know, because if you're a person like us, like we are like really passionate about healing, wellness, like, you know what I mean? So you've got to start becoming aware that, like, all right, those places or these people, they kind of, you know, they're basically just continually ripping the plaster, and you've got to make choices about, no, I want to be in more healing spaces where, you know, I can tend to this wound. I don't think those wounds ever go. I think they're with us for forever. But we just find different. And so I think you start in the unconscious space with the adaptive strategies, and then when you start to unpack and become aware, then you start to see the ways, you start to see your adaptive strategies, and then maybe you can start to address those things more, and not let those things stop you from living a full life. That's the
okay. So yeah, I feel like that was, like you said, like this internalized version of it, and more intuitive in that way of sensing, like you said, harmful and healing. So do you feel like in that pendulum swing, what was that momentum for you that kind of pushed you in? You said that with abandonment, which was, you know, the spectrum. It's like, okay, being abandoned, feeling like, you know, like everybody's going to leave me, or people are going to keep harming me, and then coming back to that other side of like, the people that are around me are actually, you know, supporting me and going to be there and are long lasting, and it's more healing. What would you say that momentum was that pushed you into that adaptive strategy, but then also was the same momentum that kind of pulled you back? Like for me, it was the rejection that pushed me that way, but then the opposite was the acceptance of coming out of it. So what was that? I mean, just for like, you know, whoever's listening or like tuning in, is like, if they have that fear of abandonment and they're in that space of adaptive strategy and maybe stuck, you know, and they're not as intuitive, or don't have that same level of like optimism to come back to that side, it's like, what is that momentum that they can kind of like leverage themselves out of to like come back to that other side?
I'll be honest, like for me, it was like therapy, like, because like the therapeutic space creates a different relational dynamic, or gives you opportunity to observe your relational dynamics in the therapeutic like space, in the therapeutic relationship. So I think up until that point, there wasn't even an awareness that this was happening. Like, it wasn't even, oh, I feel like this, and then this is what happens, and then when that happens, I react like that, and then that causes another reaction that I don't like, and then like, even that, like, I don't think even there was an awareness of that until I started to like go to therapy. And then I think what happened was that I think the therapeutic relationship over time helped me understand that there was different models for relating. And then I think that that connection to that then helps you when you go out into the world to recognize those healthier relating patterns in yourself, and then also in the people that you're relating to. um so I'm not saying like therapy isn't for everyone. I think like we all have our different ways of um coming at it, but for me that was my
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was kind of that awareness. And I remember like even very early on in my sessions with my therapist, I remember saying like there's a basement and I don't want to look at it. Like I know that there's like all this stuff there and I just don't want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like over the long term, like essentially that was like the therapeutic space was like this place where like my therapist gently helped me basically go in the basement and start
Mm-hmm.
looking at some of this stuff. And like my goodness, like when I finished I felt a lot lighter.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, like we have this I guess this imagery
Mm.
of, yes, this dance and this pendulum. So,
Mm.
that was that first like phase and that question that stirred up, which is, what was the fear that brought you through that experience and brought that experience up of just acknowledging that that
Mm-hmm.
shadow is there. And
Mm-hmm.
you know yes, I believe personally that, and I've seen this psychologically, that when we start to blame this this shadow or this way of being, then it starts to compound it and you just kind of stay in it,
Mm-hmm.
rather than looking at it objectively and saying like, oh no, like if I am light, then I have to have a shadow. It's like kind of like you sitting here and you casting this shadow. It's like
Yeah.
there is that acceptance of saying like, oh, this is that, and I'm in this
Mm-hmm.
dance, and
Mm.
this dance exists. Whether I
Mm.
like it or not, I'm gonna be dancing with this.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of segueing into the second question, which I'll let you lead with the
Mm-hmm.
question. um, I feel like with both of us, there was, again, that pendulum swing. And I think it's just that would be like the first step, which was why we brought up that first question. It's the fear, because
Mm-hmm.
behind that fear is the acknowledgement of I am the light and I am the shadow and I am one.
Mm-hmm.
But uh,
So
I'll let you lead us into this next
so
question.
yeah, I think we've kind of touched on it already. And so the next question is, where are the wounds within ourselves around these notions? So like,
Mm-hmm.
where are we holding? Yeah, where is the wounding around this dance of our fears and our shadows?
Mm.
Um, so yeah,
So for me,
yeah.
when I approach this question, and it, like, me, I'm very uh with the words, and I like to, that for me, I don't know, maybe this is a masculine thing, or guys, like, help me out with this, but it's more of a mental construct of how to, like, reason it. And for me, I was like,
Mm,
okay, a wound, like, yeah, like, like, we fall, we get hurt, we're like, okay, like, it's cool.
mm,
We kind of like have that attitude and like, yeah, it's whatever. So sometimes with like the word wounding and things like that, like, it doesn't necessarily penetrate as much as it is to like look at your knee that's scraped.
mm-hmm,
So for me, it was like, okay, what wound me to that position, like, in that
mm-hmm,
state of rejection, like, what wound me up to like keep me there, because even I would say way more or less, but even now, like, the sense of rejection, like, it is a thing that almost like compels me to kind of like stay there.
mm,
So for me, it was like this thing that kept me wound to that notion was that sense of like not being accepted, and it was
mm-hmm,
like, oh well, then with that I have to go a little bit deeper, and it's like, well, why am I looking at this sense of like not accepting this shadow, because now this shadow has brought me this overconfident person, this egotistical person, this person that, everybody says this and everybody says that about. And it's like, oh, well, if people are saying that and they're kind of pushing you away, then you're not being accepted. But it doesn't necessarily imply that,
mm,
because for me, it was a learning of my external environment doesn't dictate my internal environment. So I think with the shadow, it really perpetuates and feeds off of the external,
mm-hmm,
and I think that's a really big thing for men,
mm-hmm,
because we are masculine energy is an externalized energy. Like that is an
Mm-hmm.
outside energy. Feminine energy is more internalized, like you were kind of
Mm-hmm.
explaining.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, it was almost this, I need to be accepted, So every
Mm-hmm.
time that sense of like that rejection like pushed me, or like whatever aspect it was, it could be, within work, within a relationship, within like family dynamics, within like my friends, whatever it was, whenever that opportunity presented itself and that rejection was like, go over there, like you could possibly get rejected, and it was like, and it was like, I need to like hold on to that shadow side and be like overconfident, be
Yeah.
this and be that. And it was like, and I had to remember, like, and always consciously be aware, like, oh, this is that shadow, like, accept yourself, accept
Yeah.
yourself,
Yeah.
accept yourself, go into that light. And then for me, it was this slowing down of the pendulum and just like kind of being in the middle
Mm-hmm.
and allowing myself to not be dictated and compelled by this external energy, because ultimately that empowered me as a man and like as my masculine energy to control that external energy and be like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I am influencing this. I'm the one
Mm-hmm.
that is like, the light is going this way, it's not coming this way. So for me,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like what you said is the wound was that thing that drew me to it, because that shadow is very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
But when I really realized what was so compelling about it and what was so, um, I guess, enticing and
Mm-hmm.
like
Because
almost,
the way you describe it is like an adversarial. You must defeat. Like you will not defeat me. I am gonna like.
well, actually, it was, that was a phase that I went through because it felt so good to
Mm,
be in that space. And when it felt so good, and then I realized, like, oh, I'm in the shadow. I'm not supposed to be in the shadow, and I had to go to the other side. It
mm,
was like, oh, when I step into the shadow, it's like, no, 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 like, don't trust yourself. You can't do that. Like, no, you know what's gonna happen. Like when it gets so good, you just be in it. And you be like, oh yeah, and it's like, like self discipline, be there. So it was kind of this understanding of myself and like gauging this limit, and
mm,
this temperance of it, because the shadow, again, it exists, but it is very like tempting, and I think
mm-hmm,
that is the part of the dance, like, when just, I guess, as men, when we step into a dance, it's like, you're expected to leave, but it's
mm-hmm,
like, you know do I grab her buns? Like, do I grab the back of her head? Like, do I grab her softly? Like, how to, and then instead
mm-hmm,
of thinking about it, just release that and understand and settle into that power. And just, it's really about empowerment,
mm-hmm,
because that wound is really the healing part of that, is giving yourself that power, rather than that thing taking your power
disempowering.
from you,
Yeah.
you know?
So so many things you said is like quite mine. So I just want to pick up some of the things that you're saying.
Yeah,
Like,
for
because I
sure.
think there's something interesting about what you're saying about like as a masculine you're expected to lead, and then you're like, what should I do with this woman in front of
Uh-huh.
me? Should I do this? Should I do that? And then this is where the other side of it is like, this kind of I must externalize. Actually, where's the receptivity so that you can like read and notice, and then it's
Mm-hmm.
not even like you're having to guess. It's not, you're not having to play guesswork. You're like, oh right, like there'll be signals that are telling you like that's
Mm-hmm.
what, you know what I mean, and then
Mm-hmm.
that is a dance, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
then that is like, okay, like two people are kind of feeding each other. There's back and a forth, right? So you're not necessarily expected to just play guesswork. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? But then that requires that capacity to be receptive as well. So
Mm-hmm.
like when you're talking about healing that wound, like
Mm-hmm.
that feels like double sided, because there's that overcompensation, and then there's like the other side, which is like, I don't even want to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like somewhere in the middle, like where you say like acceptance, and that's the place where you can be both active and receptive. Like you can be receptive to what's in front of you and actually also take action and lead. um yeah, I just had that
Mm-hmm.
visualization when you were talking. um and yeah, and I think it's interesting like talking about like the wounds, um because like you say, like a wound on your body is
Mm-hmm.
so much easier to like deal with, look at, than like psychological wounds or emotional wounds that we carry with us.
But I think that's the part where men we make that connection and that correspondence. It's
Mm.
like, when you fall, like, oh, get up, like you go brush it off.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But with, if my daughter falls, I'm like, oh my god, like, are you okay? Like, how is it? Are you fine? And it's like
Yeah,
a little bit more of that internal thing to like feel the emotion.
yeah,
So
yeah,
sometimes for me, I had to make that transition because I'm all about leverage. Like whatever mechanism is in place, like, can you work with that rather than just like being like, oh, well, just feel the wound. And I'm like,
mm.
no, like, I don't really see it as a wound. So for me, it was
Yeah,
like wound, like something that tied me to
yeah,
this thing,
yeah.
like, because if it's that pendulum, it's like something came up there and was just like, stay right here, and kind of like tied me to it. But for you, you said it was this abandonment thing that came up there. So it was more of the feeling of like the hurt and the emptiness and the loss.
Yes.
So with that wound, like, how do you feel like that you kind of shifted in that notion?
Well, I think like the opposite to abandonment, I think, is a feeling of belonging, right? It's
Uh-huh.
a sense of belonging. Um, and when you're walking around with an abandonment wound, you're looking for belonging wherever you can find it,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm.
and that then often, recreates the wound, the very wound that you're trying to heal, basically, because
Mm.
looking for love in all the wrong places. You feel me?
There's a song for everything.
and but like, and then I think there's a sense that I think what and I think that is like that's your signal, right? That's your signal, like these relationships are recreating wounds, like core wounds that are already present that you're not aware of,
Uh-huh.
and then you recreate them unconsciously in relationships because you're
Mm.
not aware of this. So then I think that was, like I said, spilling enough milk, like, getting to a frustration place. That's kind of like, all right, so now I acknowledge like there's something not working here, something's not right. The other side of that, like, what does that look like? What's the healing? It's a feeling of belonging, it's a feeling of, like you say, like acceptance, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and that comes, I think, that comes relationally. I don't believe that you can I do feel like it comes relationally before it actually becomes, like, I know I know there's like, all I can hear all the self-help people going, no, you gotta love yourself first. And I'm like, yes, you do. And like, I do say I belong to myself, I do belong to myself. But how do, like, I don't even understand. That doesn't even make any sense to me. Like and I'm someone who likes to spend a lot of time on my own. Like, I'm very, very comfortable with like my own company, but I do really think that healing takes place relationally. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be like, like romantic relationship necessarily. For me, it actually predominantly came through friendships,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, and then just that beginning to feel that sense of comfortableness with people and feeling belonging and not feeling like, okay, the rug's going to get pulled under me like at any
Right.
minute. um that creates a, oh my goodness, like a deep sense of, like, yeah, security, stability, calm. And then I think from that place, then you can start to really do healing.
Mm.
I think, yeah, and
Mm.
that's an ongoing process. And then with that, then there becomes the capacity to like self-regulate,
Mm-hmm.
self-soothe,
Mm-hmm.
and then also co-regulate. And because that definitely was not like a thing that I would do. Was I would withdraw. Like, that's my default, is to withdraw, aloof, shut down. I go into my cave. I mean, all my friends know this. They're like, I think maybe she's in her cave. If they haven't heard from me for a
Yeah.
while, they're like, don't worry, take your time, because they know I just like, just need to go in, and then I'm all right. I've got that's my process. But like, over time, I've learned to co-regulate.
Mm-hmm.
So that means I'm able to share with other people and like
Mm-hmm.
have them help me. And like, but that's taken time, and that's
Mm-hmm.
still a process, very much.
Hmm.
So
So
yeah.
would you say that, like, which one would you identify as the expression of the
Mm,
shadow and the expression of the light there?
mm. I think the expression of the shadow is placing yourself in situations where you either probably unconsciously know that your core wound is going to be activated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the shadow aspect, where you kind of, it's like dog going back to its sick. Like, you just keep doing something, like, and with the same result. And then I think the light aspect is actually looking at that and going and taking some responsibility for your part, um, and then creating new relational dynamics, and then have that reflected back to you. So you're now in new relationships that are reflecting something different back to you, which then helps you then continue to cultivate that light to help you continue to see where that's not being met in all your relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So there is, like, for me, I saw, this aspect externalized, right? And there was that, that shadow of the overconfidence and that compellingness to like go back there and like have that temptation. And the lightness was also like resting into that and knowing in that empowerment. And it seems like for you, it was that shadow was like, creating that sickness and creating that harm, and that light was like finding the relationships and cultivating it. So it seems like there's this balance between, yes, this pendulum swing that's happening, but it's all about finding that center. And it sounds like, I mean, to slow down that momentum, because that's ultimately what keeps us, in this fluctuation, or it just keeps you all up on one side and then you're just completely in the shadow. And this is what kind of leaves us, in these positions of, I guess you would say, um, either like stuck or staying. Because also I do feel personally that sometimes people choose to stay in that shadow, and sometimes people choose to stay in that light because they're afraid, like you were talking about, like, not wanting to go in that basement or not wanting to look, and I'm just going to stay in the light and just keep looking over here. And in that stuckness or that staying, that is a state of being. And we kind of, whether you have this masculine energy or it's feminine energy, and however it presents, if it's externalized or internalized, it's that state of being that doesn't allow you that swing, or doesn't allow you to slow down that momentum, which is ultimately what we're talking about here, is disempowerment. And how do you step into your fullness? Like, how do you really throw it back on this guy that you like and send out the true intention? And how do you hold on to him? Be like, oh, I ain't weak. Like, how do you stay with that dance? And also, how do you read and listen and feel that flow? And then also, how do you surrender to that lead, and surrender into that femininity and go with that flow and be led? So there's all this like beauty of, the house party dance, and also like the ballroom dance. And it's like we all want to be, slow grinding and whining and be led, in a gown and in a tux, but we also still want that shadow aspect side of, like, yeah, like, throw that thing back on me in the party,
Scrub a dub in the corner.
Right, but that's what they call it, scrub a dub in the corner. Absolutely.
Or on the roadside if it's
there
carnival.
You go. Right. And I think that's the part, is like when we want to embody like doing both.
Yeah.
Because yeah, that shadow side like feels really good, and that light side is, where we should be. It's the splendid place to be. But there's this part where, that kind of brought up this next question for us, was like, was it about like feeling free, right? And
resilient,
free
and connect. So like, when do we feel free, resilient, and connected?
Right. And for me, these were very reflective traits. Because when I look at resilience, there are some things that are in the shadow, and when I look at free, there are some things that kind of like pushed me into the light. And when I hear connected, I find that in like that center, and what can I do to integrate this shadow without, the blame and the guilt and the resentment, and being like, oh God, like, you got me into so much trouble, and you got me into this. And I'm a personal believer in that empowerment of being like, okay, say, all right, let's take, for example, just in my, this was kind of what led me to this, is like where I felt those things was like when I was younger and I was in that shadow mode. It was always like, you know, when I'm going out, I'm super charismatic. Like I talk to everybody. I'm a social butterfly. I'm like all around. And there's just this magic that happens, right? But then there was also the aspect of like my tolerance, and I would like stay out all night, or like, you know, even if we started like drinking or whatever, or if like we would smoke a little bit, I'm the one that like I'm either 100 or I'm nothing. So when it's 100 and like people are kind of at 75, 80, I'm like, no,
You're like,
we going ham.
let's crank it right
Right.
up. Like,
And I think that is the part of like resilience that kind of had like this little tinge to it, because in the shadow it was like, oh, you can endure this. And even like when it came down to relationships, um there, especially like growing up in New York and being in a relationship with a woman from New York, like you got to endure a lot of shit, you know, like it's tough love, but that shit's real, you know, like I've been cursed out by women, like all types of things, and it's rough. So this sense of like resilient, it was like this shadow side would be like, oh, you can handle that, like go ahead. And it's like, no, you know, but when I connected to that other side, it's like, yeah, like I can endure that, but do I have to? You know, same thing comes with work. You know, just because I used to be a workaholic and, you know, get up at 4 a.m., go to the gym for 2 hours, smash my whole body, then go to work and like work on like 6 or 7 people during the day doing body work, then come home and like cook and then go out that night. And then like, why did I, you know, that was the endurance. The tolerance level was at 100, probably 150. But that resilience is kind of there, and like disconnecting that and coming down and being like, this is where I want to be, this medium level, this balance, that gave me the freedom. So it was like this question like brought up a lot in a sense of what the process was, you know, rewriting what resilience meant. You know, it doesn't mean that, okay, because you can be resilient that you have to be resilient, you know. And the sense of connectedness is like, how am I connected to this resilience? How I was connected was like, oh, endurance. You can endure this, you know, stay in this relationship, you know, keep going at it. And it was exactly what you just said, is like that creation of like being in the shadow, creating that sickness or that conflict and continuously repeating those patterns. For me, I would see that as like, that's how I learned. I was like, I would put myself in a relationship and see certain things and be like, oh no, like let's jump into the fire. But sometimes that didn't feel good for my partner, you know? So it was also like, how do I shift that connection, you know? And ultimately, that is what gave me what, you know, I was looking for, is like feeling free. And I was like, okay, like I'm free to acknowledge this shadow and this resilience and how it looked, and also disconnect from that and also see that there is this other side. But I don't necessarily have to be passive and like, you know, super sensitive and be like, oh, like everything is no, you know, I'm just not going to do anything. Like, no, I can be in the middle and rest at a 50 sometimes.
I don't think you're ever a 50, but
yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, it's like 100 or 100.
Yeah.
So let me find that middle ground. But what did this question bring for you, just to get to like an internal aspect of it?
I guess I feel like this question for me is like, when can I be in a space when I'm fully present to everything that's happening for me, that is like both my light and my shadow. So I mean, if you ask me when do I feel free, connected and resilient, I will always tell you it's on my mat. Like that is when all of those things are present.
You say your mat, not your man, right?
No, my mat.
Oh,
when
okay,
I'm on my mat.
Okay. I was like,
I mean, that could work as well, but no.
Right.
I meant on my mat. Yeah, and I think like when I think of like resilience, I think of like our allostatic load, like basically our capacity to hold stress without it becoming like, without it overwhelming us, right?
Okay, say that again for like, the unenlightened.
So your allostatic load is basically your capacity, your body's capacity to hold stress.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, so basically your body has like a, maybe like, so say if your stress load is here, right? That's all the stress that your body can hold. So anything more than that is going to send you out of balance, right? And then there's some people who like have this capacity to hold a massive amount of stress, but it's actually still really bad for them. So your allostatic load is basically that dance, basically where your homeostasis, where you're like, you got a good amount of like, because we need to be challenged. Like you said, you don't want to be like a little like, no, oh, we can't even go outside, or like, you know what I mean? Like you've got to have some resilience. Like this is life. Like life is life in, and you got to be ready for it. Like it's not, you know, it's not game out here, right? And you've got to be ready for it. But then at the same time, I think our culture has gone too far the other way, where we're like, you know, like you say, there's like valor in the like, go on, go harder, endure. But there's something in the middle where it's like, okay, you've got that capacity to deal with stress as it comes, but you're not in that place where you're like, oh, you're over functioning, basically, over functioning in a place of over stress. And yoga, sorry, the yogi here on the hard sell again, but like yoga specifically works that action of like basically expanding your capacity to hold stress, but without you necessarily being in a stressful place. And that's what I call resilience. It's when you can hold the challenges that life brings to you without either going into like, oh, I go, you know what I mean? I'm just gonna just like, you know, become harder, become stronger, become faster, become like, you know what I mean? Like you actually, no, I can actually process like the stress, exit it, and then carry on with my life and still find the capacity within me to access softness, calm, peace. Like it's that, basically the ability to hold both when you need it, right tools for the right time. And then, yeah. And then I would also say nature. I think that's another time. You used to ask me like when do I feel these capacities? Free, connected, resilient in nature. Yeah.
So we shouldn't be listening to Kanye West, you know, work it harder, make it faster, do it better, make it stronger. I mean, he be on point with some things, but definitely that. No.
I mean, it's very aligned with the culture, which is very capitalist, which is like overwork. I mean, particularly, you know, American culture even more so than British culture. I mean, we've like actually got a working directive, not for long, but anyway, that's another story. But like, even I know it's like in America, like vacations considered like like almost like a myth. You're not supposed to have a vacation. That's almost like that's because you've got to keep working. Everyone's entrepreneurial. You know, if you don't get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do it till 9 o'clock, you know, you're never gonna make it. It's like a real, and that's the culture. I mean, like,
but that's that thing of the shadow aspect of the masculine energy. You know, of like the action of the doing. You know, and I think in that, you know, like there's, you know, those 6 archetypes of the masculine energy. You know, the god, the king, the magician, the priest, the warrior,
and the lover.
The lover, yes. So I feel like it plays on this natural innate thing that is within us, but again we come to that excess, you know, of that pendulum swing of like doing it too much, and it's like, where is that balance? And I think it's we found it kind of in this question of taking notice of these things that give us that freedom, that connectedness, that resilience. And the way that you just explained that sense of resilience, it's like that for me is, you know, the internalized version of it, because I'm like, okay, you know, the endurance is like outside, and like I had to alchemize that, and like that made me well, it brought me through a process to transform that masculine illusion that was there to give me my masculine truth. So with this, it's like, you know, this is why I think that this podcast one is just really beautiful, because you give like that internalized version of that resilience, and like how to transform that and alchemize that from the inside of being like, well, this is what it looks like, you know, and then this is what it feels like giving the somatics of, you know, this stress, and being like, okay, you have this center, and like, how does it feel to me? How does it feel to my body? And I remember a piece that I wrote about that spoke something like this, and I wish I had something as super eloquent as the Aristotle. What did you call it? Allostatic, like approach to it, because it's about like distress and eustress. You know, like eustress being euphoric stress of, the things like, say, working out, you get to a certain level where you have to put yourself under that to gain muscle and
Yeah.
to gain this confidence and to to hit a certain level of dopamine and testosterone, things like that. And then you have the level of distress where you go out of what you were speaking about as like this limit where it's like not like the stress that's not good for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part. It's like when you have this question that can help you look at the things that give you the connection, the way that you look at being resilient, and then also what you're ultimately looking to get out of that, which is that freedom. It starts to like unfurl this thing for you to really look at, like, wow, like how am I actually approaching stress, and how am I actually dealing with this momentum that's pulling me from shadow to light, and I can't really see it.
Yeah, and I think there's like another way, like as you were talking, it made me think actually maybe another way of saying it is like a kind of dynamism of the capacity to like
Dynamism. Look at all these words. You're just dropping the gems. Oh, I'm loving it. Go ahead.
But yeah, like that capacity to draw on what you need at any given moment. But kind of coming back to the dance between the shadow and the light, like it's very difficult to start drawing on different aspects of yourself and have that dynamism when you haven't really looked at all of yourself. Because like you were saying, like actually your shadow can be like useful. You can actually start to draw out energy from your shadow. Like actually can give you energy if used correctly, if alchemized in the right way. But if you're not even aware of it, there's a whole part of yourself that is just being underutilized, weighing you down because you don't even look at it and it's just playing out in your life. Whereas if you start to become more aware of these parts of yourself, then there's more dynamism. Then you can pull things out of the bag as you need to based upon whatever the situation is in front of you. And like you were saying, like you're not necessarily like overcompensating or undercompensating, and then or under functioning, maybe you want to say. But I just wanted to say, just on a note of like allostatic load, it's like connected to trauma, like trauma, not necessarily trauma with a big T, could be small t, but essentially it's the way our bodies manage stress, because like it's the fight or flight, or like, oh, I'm just going to go into myself and freeze, or I'm just going to fight. I'm like, no, I'm not having it. I'm going to come all the way out of it. And then there's like these kind of different ways our body responds to like fear or stress. And I think that's kind of what, like, now I'm thinking about, I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about here. And there's the middle bit is like where you basically have a really healthy, like almost elastic allostatic load, which has the capacity to like draw back if you need to, move forward if you need to, or stay in the middle when you need, you know what I mean? Because then you have the capacity to rest when you need to, you have the capacity to jet, and like, you know what I mean? Like maybe it's time to fight if you need to.
Don't go too far into the advice point of like what really this is like, that's the tool of the capacity, and like the capacity is the dance. Because just like to kind of backtrack a little bit on what you said, is like to get this sense of the whole, and you have this capability to draw out of the two, and it's kind of like what we spoke about before, is this simultaneous contrast, like if this is this middle point, right, and it's like a perfect example, like us sitting here, right, and you have, say, the shadow and you have the light, and well, you have the light and you have the shadow and you have the shadow and then the light and it's like there's this dynamic that you can step back from yourself and look at both and be like, okay, I was there and that's who I was, and there's that acceptance of that thing, and also I'm this too, and kind of just look straight down the middle and be like, okay, I can see both of them happening and two truths are existing, but this is what I'm creating. I'm creating this balance in between, and it's kind of like what you said, is when you slow down that pendulum, you're not just looking at it as like it's straight here. You're kind of getting this whole like momentum build, because now you're working the shadow with the light, and you can just continuously like keep looping, and it's literally like magic, and it's like how you're creating a portal. You're not just working on this linear, two-dimensional kind of thing, just kind of swinging here. But when you start pushing a little bit more momentum, and then you start making this full circle, you can literally start creating these portals for yourself to walk through. And you're not necessarily reacting. You're not necessarily responding. You're literally creating a whole new dynamic and a whole new thing. And this is kind of what brought this last question about, is like, where is that resistance of um forgiveness in the body,
Mm.
or maybe in the external, like where do you have this resistance to forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
and for me, how I answered this question around it was was that same thing of what I just explained. And it was like, I have to forgive this sense of the shadow and being in this excess, and I also have to forgive this sense of being in depletion,
Mm-hmm.
and really forgiveness for me. And if I don't know if if you're listening to this and you're watching this video, if forgiveness is something that is a little bit difficult to kind of like grasp.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, like, how do I forgive myself? I know that this is all about self love, and how do I love myself? And you start to roll around in this paradox. And
Mm-hmm.
what I feel like is, this sense of the circle, sometimes that can be confusing for a person, because it's like, oh,
Mm.
this cycle also is synonymous to like a pattern or a circle, and it's like, oh, like shit, and then this feeling feels the same, and like, oh, and it's like,
Yeah.
no, okay, slow down for a little bit. Once you gain a direction, you gain a point, then that cycle still has to continue like in a direction. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, that sense of discipline, and discipline in the sense of learning, it was like, I had to learn, what am I giving this for?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how like forgiveness came in. Like, what am I giving this shadow up for?
Yeah. Yes.
What am I giving this light, or this sense of like being passive, and like kind of going into that full acceptance of everything, because when
Mm-hmm.
you're in a position, and I found myself in this place of like pure acceptance, and I started feeling almost like disempowered, because it's like, when do I take the power and the charge of my own life?
Mm-hmm.
So it was
Mm-hmm.
like, I had to forgive that side too, and then
Mm-hmm.
it allowed me to kind of just allow them to go in full circle.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm.
ultimately just kind of gave birth to this new direction of like, wow, you can actually create whatever you choose, because now you're in full forgiveness, if that's a word, in both of them, and
Mm-hmm.
the resistance was really, I thought I only could do this,
Yeah. Yeah.
like this half
Yeah.
circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's where we're kind of, we always want to speak about is embodying it wholly,
Yeah.
not just half circle shit,
Yeah.
like, you need to dissolve that resistance, notice that momentum, so you can find that balance. But then when it comes up again, you can just complete this full circle. So
Mm.
for me, that resistance was in that,
Mm-hmm.
it was
Mm-hmm.
in noticing it, and pinpointing, what am I giving this up for? Like, that
Mm-hmm.
became my question.
Mm-hmm.
And once I started doing that, it dissolved the resistance like that, and I was
Mm-hmm.
able to just, whatever a situation came up, whether it be rejection, whether it be, willpower, whether it be imagination, things that I could even imagine,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and it brought a lot of power in for me. So
Hmm. It's so interesting. Like it's always so interesting. We have such different, like different, so. I love it though. I love it. It's really interesting. Because I feel like what you're saying is like how, and I think ultimately like the state is the same. Like how does this not become something that makes me smaller, basically? Like the kind of like, if I condense what you're saying, is like, how
mm,
does this, like, essentially what you're saying is like, I know I want to expand, I want to like I don't want to like almost reject like any part of me. And
mm-hmm,
if that's just going to make me into this, like, by not doing that, I'm suddenly this. Oh no, I'm not that. Like, and like you say,
mm-hmm,
just kind of swinging from both, but actually like, how do I accept both of these parts? And then suddenly there's more spaciousness
mm-hmm,
to be authentic, to be
mm-hmm,
true, to be
mm-hmm,
yourself.
mm-hmm,
Um, and yeah, I think like I definitely would say like the resistance to forgiveness. Wouldn't necessarily say resistance, but I definitely think a point where it's difficult, like,
mm-hmm,
is when you do become more aware of your patterns, and then you do become aware of the part that you played
mm,
in the things that you know that have been harmful to you. I
mm,
think there's something around that where there's a forgiveness of the person you were when you weren't aware, and when you did things
mm,
that you're not proud of, or allow things to happen to you that you're not proud of. That I think there is something about like forgiving that old self.
mm,
And I think that can be hard, particularly when you know suddenly you've got so much more awareness, it's like it's great, like like come back to the third question, feeling free, connected. But there was a time when it wasn't like that, and I think there's like that resistance to forgiveness is like, oh well, that has to include even that part of me that didn't know better, that was just working with adaptive strategies, that was just like just doing whatever, like whatever was necessary at any given time to supposedly get what you want. Yeah, that's what I definitely would say. Like, I think there was that realization. I think in like on my journey of healing, there was a point at which I was like, oh look, like could see how far I'd come, and there was like a feeling of like, oh man, like this is good. But then there was also like, oh man, I made such a hash of it. I could have done so much better. Like, do you know what I mean? And then I think there was just like that forgiving of my past selves. Yeah.
So what was like an active thing that you did to bring that forgiveness in? Because it seems like, so how I explained it was like this, this verbiage and this mental kind of construct to see how I needed to like release that, but in a sense of like when you were talking about this intuitive, like this internal sense, for like like masculine or men to kind of understand this intuitive portion of forgiveness. Like, what does that look and feel like?
I think it looks and feels like claiming back all of those parts of yourself that you would rather cut loose, or the parts of yourself that have played out, like past selves, like the past, like those past parts of yourself.
Like, how do you do that kindly and like with grace? Because I'm coming from a guy, like because when you were explaining, I was placing myself there, like, oh, I looked back like on my healing journey, it was like, oh, you made a hash of it. I'm like, I was looking at myself like, man, you fucked up. Like, why would you do some dumb shit? Like I feel like that's like sometimes how guys talk to ourselves.
But then that's part of the forgiveness journey. I mean, first of all, it is berating the self. I guess it is. Like, it's like, no, why have you done that? The anger, like all of that's the whole process of emotions, like that whole journey.
Yeah.
Come on then, darling. Come on then, get involved.
This is good,
This is Cece, baby. She said, I've had enough. I want to be on the sofa now.
She said, oh, y'all forgiven? Forgive me for being so cute.
We can do that, darling. Yeah, I think that's a whole I don't think it comes. That's what I'm saying. I don't think I've made it sound like, oh yeah, I just forgave myself. No, it didn't work like that. I mean, there was like a lot of like frustration, anger, regret. Like, those are that's the whole process of emotions. You have to. I mean, that is like, it's a process. It's not necessarily like. And I
thought it was just beautiful.
I mean,
the way you explained it, I was like, oh my god.
I wish it was like that. Like with a wish of a wand, all was forgiven. And like, no, I think it is like reclaiming those parts, and also with a lot of compassion, because you're like, hey, you know what? All right, that part of myself, my old self, did things that like maybe I wasn't proud of, or like, now I know better. I wish I'd had more awareness in those situations. I would have made different choices. But I think there was something about reclaiming those parts of myself and saying, like, basically taking that younger self back under my wing and saying, all right, it's okay. You didn't know better. You didn't know as much as you know, and that's okay. And like, actually, like, not necessarily reparenting, but like kind of re-giving yourself that, like the talk that you would have given my younger self. You know what I mean? Like, hey, listen, you didn't know better. Like, like, and actually, if things hadn't played out the way that they played, I wouldn't be here now. I wouldn't know these things now. So it's that's just the way it has to be. And like, I don't know why life made it like that, but that's how life made it. And
beautiful. Because that sounds like a little bit more like tangible in kind of like what we want to approach with this actual dilemma of like the dancing, because the dancing is really about like what we've kind of just explained, like, yes, you have this masculine side, you have this feminine side, you have this light, you have this shadow, and they have their polarities. But instead of identifying with one of them, you're kind of explaining like the person that you're growing into.
Yeah.
You know, like this
Yeah.
maturing of this, or maturing of this light being that you are, and almost being like, okay, like I can take a step back and I don't have to be in it and like be involved in both and just in the swing of everything. It's
Yeah.
like sit back and like king, sit on your throne and sit there, you know, and like queen, sit down and like
Yeah.
you know, rule from there. And it's the like the advice that I guess kind of came around, you know, to kind of understanding this dance was really just capacity. And it's like, how do you create capacity, you know? And for me, like the advice would be to what I did to create that capacity in myself was one, like just as a masculine, like my masculine energy had to create space with the words and the verbiage and the understanding and how to speak to my, you know, younger self, and how to speak to my shadow and how to speak to my light, and you know, also encourage my light to be like, yo, you don't have to fucking do nothing, you know, like get up and do something, but don't do that shit, you know. But then there was also that feminine aspect of me as well, where I had to intuitively say, okay, when is too much, and like temper it down and like feel out like, okay, where is that momentum and when do you need to like see this whole thing, and also to see clearly and intuitively to say, okay, like this is what I want to create. Like, yes, I see this happening. Yes, I see this happening. Yeah, I could do that. And yeah, I could do this. But this is what I want to do. And this is what like my higher self is intuiting so that I can go in this direction. So that, yeah, I can create that spiral, but I'm going towards something, you know? And in that advice, it was like a lot of practice for me. And a lot of practice for me looked like writing a lot of things out, you know, like writing out, you know, what resilience meant, what connectedness meant, where were those things, and kind of seeing it. And I have to like, that was my process, was like seeing it on paper and being like, oh, okay, that's that. This is my shit. Okay, this is what I need to forgive. And like, okay, well, forgive, like, how do you do that? Like, I don't need to forgive myself. Like, yeah, okay, I forgive. But it's like, how do you embody it? And that's where you make the real shift. And for me, that is where I felt the expansiveness, because especially like for men, it's good for us to get that stuff out of here and like place it down, whether it be in a paper, whether it be speaking, whatever the case is. But also that feminine aspect of me was like, okay, well, how do I ignite those feelings and like, you know, actually activate it? So it was like, okay, once this stuff was out, then this stuff can activate. And it was just like a consistent process of that. And in that gave me the expansion to be like, wow, now I have more capacity. Now I can invite this consciousness in to say, I can be in my shadow and I can be in my light. And that for me is the dance. Because whatever opportunity presents itself, whether, you know, it's me selling my quad and having to talk to a guy that is completely out of balance, like, how do you keep that composure? How do you balance and dance with the energy that's outside? Because ultimately that's what we want to do, right? It's like, yeah, we can do it inside, but how does that happen, you know, like when your ex shows up at your door, or like, you know, does some random shit, or like, you know, somebody cuts you off in the road, like, how do you dance with that, you know, with a stranger? So yeah, I think that would kind of just be like my tool. But what do you feel like is another tool that you could offer here?
Yeah, I think like I think doing things that feel good, right, is a good sign that you're in a good place. But obviously, over excess, like attachment to things that feel good, like the excess of that is not so good. But I definitely think that that's your signal. You know what I mean? Like when things feel good and feel like they flow, that's always generally a good sign. So I guess I'm coming like I'm like, it's always about like, how does it feel? Like how is it feeling to me? Is it, do I feel off? Do I feel weird? Do I feel disconnected? Am I like really in touch with myself, or am I, you know, am I being disembodied? Am I disassociating, or like, you know what I mean? And I think that's just that, I don't know, for me it's always been like that like body awareness, like what's going on in my body, like how am I feeling, and that being the feedback in the space. And obviously that fluctuates, right? And what you were saying is absolutely right. you can't let that always be dictated by your external environment, because otherwise you'll be like, "Wah, wah, wah," like in out, like whatever happens. So you
Become
have
like
to,
a puppet.
yeah, exactly. So you have to know your, like your core state, and then just, I feel like it's like finding that resonance outside of yourself. Those places where you almost like you put out your energy, it comes back, and there's like, back to that dance.
Right.
So yeah, definitely feel like, yeah, when things feel good. And then also what you said, I think that was absolutely right, when you sit on your throne, that capacity to not be reactive, because things happen. You don't have to react to those things straight away, or at
respond.
all, or respond at all. Yeah, exactly.
You have that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just because something comes to you does not mean you have to. It's not
it
part of my.
Elicit a response or a reaction. You don't have to do anything. But I think what it sounds like to me is like what you're saying, because you have this deep connection with your body and this intuition, this feeling, and this like somatics of it. But I think there is, like, just for me, I'm internalizing this as like the activity of the senses, and like for me that's sensitivity. So what is something that you developed to like fine tune that sensitivity?
Yeah, I think definitely like somatic practices, like being able to like locate and know what's going on for you at any given moment, because I think like that's really hard for us, because I feel like so many of us, particularly us that come from like big major cities like London, New York, or other places like that, like actually those cultures are like demand that you be disembodied, demanding you be completely disconnected from yourself almost constantly, because your body's giving you warning signs all the time, like it's saying this is stressful, this don't feel good, I don't like this, like, you know what I mean? But we keep doing it because our mind has told us like, no, that's good, I need to do that, that's how it should be. And then we've imposed our mind on the thing, and then the body has to follow and slam into that. Whereas I think like the whole practice of being able to listen to your body is being able to really, really observe, like, oh, like where's the discomfort, is there a constriction, and don't ignore it. And I feel like our bodies actually have more information often than the mind, because the mind, like you say, is like has a construct, and it's like, and then it's letting, and everything has to fit into that construct, whereas the body is just telling you. And that is where it's like, yeah, that's where I would say the truth of like what you're actually experiencing is there. And I trying to think like, how did I definitely think body work helped, any kind of body work. So that's like literal kind of therapeutic body work, massage, yoga, exercise, yes, for endorphins, because you know what it feels like to feel good in your body. But I don't necessarily think like exercise itself connects you really to that, because because exercise again is all about pushing past your limits, which is needed, it's necessary, it's good, but not necessarily a good practice for specifically activating
like sensitivity.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like, I mean, I would ultimately say find spaces where you have the ability to be vulnerable, where you really have the ability for other people specifically to hold what is present for you. Because I think, and like I said, as someone who very much likes their cave, I just like it's fine, I've got this, I'm doing it, I'll be working it out by myself, it's fine. But that misses the whole opportunity to be in that icky, sticky, vulnerable, uncomfortable place.
To really feel it.
Feel it, exactly.
Right,
and then you really, really, I think, with others, have the capacity to really, like, in a, if it's held by the right person in the right space, the right conditions, obviously.
And that, I think that kind of ties it. It does tie it around to that beginning part that you said that was so important about things being relational and developing that activation of being around people, but going internal, having that notice and that awareness, and asking those questions and seeing these things and drawing them out and acknowledging them, and then coming out and putting them into practice, because the practice is the doing. And I think just kind of what you were saying with the body having all that information, it has all of these senses. Like we don't just have our five senses. We have, our proprioception, our sense of temperature, of all these different things, and our all of our senses that come
Mm-hmm.
in. But
Mm-hmm.
it's really just telling you how it feels to what your mind is creating.
Mm-hmm.
So if my mind is creating this sense of me being, if I'm in the shadow, my mind is in the shadow, I'm creating this thing when I'm dancing with this partner or in
Mm-hmm.
this particular situation, my body is pulling back all the receptors. So it's consistently doing this, and developing that sensitivity within the body can help. Like
Yeah.
for me personally, in that practice, it was more so like meditation, and mentally placing myself, like
Mm-hmm.
visualizing
Mm-hmm.
myself in those particular situations that made me uncomfortable, that
Mm-hmm.
made me feel rejected, that made me feel all of these trigger spaces, and was like, oh, okay, like sitting and listening, and just literally listening to my body, and like, oh, like where is that, so
Mm-hmm.
that that makes, it makes a lot of sense, because when we start looking at our body in that way, and we start listening, like that
Mm-hmm.
listening is the feminine energy, of receiving,
Mm-hmm.
and that masculine energy is like, okay, I'm enacting, I'm
What am
doing
I going
this
to do
thing,
about that now? Yeah.
exactly. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that is, another form of exactly what we were talking about with this dance between that shadow and that light, and just accepting it all. So there was like a lot of tools that, we kind of went over, of, even going through forgiveness and forgiving both of those aspects, so that we can see this whole process,
Mm-hmm.
and, the somatic practices that we can do, and
Mm-hmm.
just how they show up. But ultimately it comes down to realizing that the dance that is happening inside is the dance that's happening outside,
Mm-hmm.
and anything
Mm-hmm.
outside is not happening to you, it's
Mm-hmm.
happening from or for you.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think with that's the dance, and it's like to
That's the
enjoy
dance.
it, whether you in the basement and you getting it down and dirty, or if you're in the light and everybody's watching you, and you still can, have that composure and just dance beautifully around
Mm-hmm.
the whole room. Like life, the world is a stage, so we should all be dancing on it.
100%. So I wanted to jump in. So you
Uh-huh.
made me think of something, and I was like, oh no, that's such a good place to wrap up there. But I'm like,
Uh-huh.
can I throw in this?
Of course.
Okay, so like it made me think of like what you were saying, like so in like in Ayurveda. Anyway, you have like these three different like energies, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you have like
Kapha dosha.
no,
Vata.
like no, that's no, it isn't. It's your like I've forgotten where it's come from now. But it's basically like these three different energies. So you've got like Rajastic, which is like fire,
The
heat,
rajas.
like yeah, like
Yeah.
that's like yeah, that's
Okay.
it. The Rajas, that's it. And
The ohas and the tehas.
I don't know that.
Yeah. Rajas, ohas, tehas.
No, it's like Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. Like so you
Ah,
have
sattva. Yes, yes,
yeah,
yes,
so
yes.
you kind of got
Okay.
like the Rajastic, which is like the kind of like the heat, the fire, the like the go, like
Uh-huh.
that spectrum, and then you've got the Tamas, which is like basically like sluggish, it's slow, it's heavy, it's like
Uh-huh.
dense. And then you got Sattvic, which is obviously light and like and like it's kind of the energy that's in all of nature, it's in our food, it's in us. But then like so like the yogis say like ultimately you want to cultivate a sattvic state. So we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to work towards the light, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though we have like all of these energies inside of us, they alchemize, we're creating the light. But eventually you want to transcend even sattva. Like so
Mm-hmm.
ultimately like all right, we're trying to like kind of said that's kind of what I meant when I say like when something feels good, it's a sense of like that's what's going to bring you to the ultimate path of healing,
Mm-hmm.
which is like like ultimate like transcendence, like I guess, which is but at first like sattva is the thing you want to go towards. You want to
Mm-hmm.
that's your signal. That's your kind of the light almost that's shining, going this way, this way, this
Mm-hmm.
way, and that's the thing you follow. And then like ultimately in the end, like ultimately you're even trying to like transcend even sattva. So
Mm-hmm.
that's not the end state, even though that's the good state. It's not the end state. It's just the signal that tells you that's the path. It's the
Bueno.
little
So yeah, we definitely gotta make that one of the later episodes. Once we start breaking down the different levels and start diving a little bit more into that actual stage of like the enlightened and the transcendence, because
Mm-hmm.
I do feel a lot on that transcendence aspect, but for definitely for another
Oh,
episode. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I was not gonna come out there with like
Right. Another 2 hours. But thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you really enjoyed this dance between the masculine and feminine, and start to come to explore and question and inquire a little bit more about the light, about the shadow, and how we can just really look at them in a totality, in simultaneous contrast, and just really step back and practice that non-involvement. So thank you guys for tuning in with beautiful Shaka. Always a pleasure. Always, always, always. And y'all gonna see us on the next one. So stay tuned and be ready for more. If you like this episode and would like to explore more perspectives like this with me, as we get a bit more intimate and intricate look into our internal vibrations, be sure to tune in to next week's episode and subscribe for more. Until then, keep frequently speaking what you frequently see.